adults can come together, share ideas, have opposite opinions, and still engage in civil discourse. So I would just remind everyone that you may not agree with everything you hear tonight. You may feel strongly about your opinions, but I would like to remind everyone that we are in a school. Although we may not think that our children are listening to us, but they're watching every single thing that we do as we model to them as adults. So I would just remind everyone of that, and thank you and welcome you. And at this time, introduce to you Mr. James Davis, the principal of Bradley Elementary School.
Good evening. Welcome to the James A. Meyer Performing Arts Complex here at New Hartford Central School. As Dr. Tangora said, my name is James Davis. I'm the principal here at Bradley Elementary. We're honored to welcome all of you for this town hall meeting with Congressman Brandon Williams. I used to be a history teacher, so an evening like this ordinarily would have been extra credit for my students. So if there's anybody out there that needs me to vouch for you, just send me an email, let me know, and we'll try to get the extra credit your way. That goes for my son. I don't know where he went. Lincoln Davis, my 5th grader right behind me here. Maybe a little extra credit for him as well. Congressman Brandon Williams was born in Dallas, Texas, and attended Pepperdine University in California, where he received a BA in liberal arts. In August of 1990, during the build-up to the First Gulf War, Brandon volunteered to serve as a nuclear submarine officer for the Navy. He graduated from college in December 1990 and reported to Officer Candidate School in March 1991. Transitioning into the nuclear engineering training was a deeply steep learning curve, one which he successfully accomplished against significant odds. During his military service, he made 6 strategic deterrent patrols in the Pacific aboard the USS Georgia, serving as a strategic missile officer. Early in his military service, he fell in love and married Stephanie McRae Williams, daughter of a senior Army officer and Vietnam veteran, Colonel McRae, who was awarded 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. Stephanie grew up on an Army base and experienced firsthand the threats of communism while her father was stationed in Germany on the front lines of the Cold War. Following his Navy service, Brandon attended the renowned Wharton School in Philadelphia, earning an MBA double majoring in operations and information management and finance. Brandon's military career and entrepreneurial career have taken him and his family around this country, but they landed in central New York in 2010. Together, Brandon and Stephanie started an agribusiness in the Finger Lakes region and participated in attracting tourists and economic development to our community. Brandon is also a pioneer in innovation, founding a software company that now helps large industrial manufacturers modernize their production plants, secure their critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, and pave the way for reduced emissions through advances in artificial intelligence. Today, Brandon humbly represents the people of New York's 22nd District in Congress. Brandon is an entrepreneur, a husband of 30 years, the father of 2 adult children, and a veteran of the U.S. Navy. Lincoln.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please give a warm welcome to Congressman Brandon Williams.
Thank you very much. Before we get started, I do just want to say thank you to Mr. Tangora for providing this facility for us. Mr. Davis specifically is a beautiful school, and for setting the tone for what will be hopefully a good exchange and dialogue. I also want to thank Chief Fontaine of the Town of New Hartford Police for you and your officers. Thank you very much for all that you do. Thank you so much for being here. And to our moderator, Rocco, second time. There are thankless jobs in this world, and moderating is right up there with thankless jobs. So thank you for doing that. Before we get started this evening, would you please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great, thank you. It's a great audience, and I can see just from the turnout that you are concerned about our country and you're concerned about the direction that we're heading, whether it's locally or nationally, and you've elected to come out and participate in this event. And this event is a dialogue. I'll try to describe that as we go along. So thank you all for choosing to participate. I just want to add a little bit more color to my background and experience, because I think it is important that as you walk away from here, whether you agree with me or not, that you have a general idea of who I am. Who is it that represents you in Washington, D.C.? Mr. Davis walked through, and Lincoln walked through my background. I am the second of 5 children. As I mentioned, or was mentioned, I grew up in Dallas. My parents are from New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, those areas, and grew up relatively poor, but my father ended up having a very successful business career that I got to witness as a child. One of the great opportunities that I had serving in the Navy was the responsibility of supervising the operation of a nuclear power plant. I have thousands of hours supervising the operation of nuclear power plants. I'm qualified on 2 separate designs, naval designs. In my entrepreneurial career, I've spent a lot of time with technology, specifically around cloud infrastructure. If you're familiar with how the big tech companies work on the back end, same thing for global telecommunications and a lot of how those systems and networks work, as well as a number of other technologies related to, for example, taking heavy metals out of water or soil, or how to build a low CO2 or design a low carbon dioxide cement, for example. So the reason I emphasize those things in my background is that I think understanding of complex issues and understanding of technologies, of the economy, understanding business, understanding how the real world works is something that's missing in our political leadership. I also want to just touch on the motivation to run. You may find it interesting that 18 months ago, I didn't know a single person in the Republican committees in this district. So for all of, and as I mentioned, I have a lot of experience with technology. But what I was saying is that I had never been in politics before. I had not imagined myself serving in Congress. I had not been conspiring or plotting or planning a political career. But about 18 months ago, my wife and I decided that if we needed better leadership in our country, then why not us? And if not now, then when would we step up to provide that kind of leadership? And as I look out, I assume that most of you, or perhaps almost all of you, also have not served in public office. I appreciate those who have, including Mr. Salka. John, thank you for your public service. And it's public service on the back of a career in healthcare that he also provided. So it's not to be disparaging of politicians, but very much like you, I just simply decided out of the blue to stand up and run for Congress. And so I think if you can imagine yourself up here, or imagine yourself walking into the Capitol, you would realize what a tremendous honor it is to stand here to represent you, because just 18 months ago I was you. And this is my first time to participate in the process. The last thing I'd like to share with you is the purpose of this town hall. And our system of government requires a dialogue, and which is what I mentioned as I opened, that this is an important dialogue. And if you read Alexis de Tocqueville, or if you go back to your civics class, you realize that even though we have an imperfect system, it's still the best system, but it requires that we be engaged, that we be in discussion, and that we work out together the best way to govern ourselves. It's the essence of our republic. It's the essence of self-government, and it is a 240-year experiment that certainly has been tried and tested, a great civil war, and certainly a great deal of strife and division that we have today. So again, I thank you for showing up and participating in the dialogue. And I would like to, before we get started with the questions, try to describe the first 100 days or so of serving in Congress. You may have noticed that it took us a few votes to get to a speaker. And C-SPAN viewership has probably never been higher. Maybe some of you tuned in to that process. One of the things that I observed as I showed up 4 days in a row for many hours a day to make these calls is it gave me a chance to spend a lot of time with these new members, with other members of Congress, and to engage in dialogue and discussion. It also helped me learn their names, because 15 times they all stood up and answered to their names and and waved. But much deeper than that, what we really saw was a disagreement in the Republican Party that played out on national TV night after night after night. And a lot of people commented to me, well, wasn't that terrible? And I think actually just the opposite, that when you're picking the leader of the House of Representatives, would you rather have a 15-minute coronation or a 4-day open debate and dialogue in front of the American people? And I would say quite firmly that we're better served by having that discussion out in front of the American people. That is how our democracy was designed to work. So actually those first 4 days I think were very useful, not just because I learned names, but I think it affirmed the strength of our system. The things that I have focused on, and the things that the Republican majority have focused on, just to pick three I think that stand out: energy, education, and spending. And I'll just, again, comment at a very high level. One of the things that concerns me about energy is, number one, it's contributing a lot to inflation. I think we certainly have a 40-year high level of inflation that has a very punishing effect on the middle class, particularly those that live paycheck to paycheck. And I think the energy policy of our current administration are deliberately set and greatly contributing to driving energy prices higher. As someone with a lot of expertise in energy myself, that I am actually glad that is something that we have focused on. I think that energy security is national security, and having those domestic sources, particularly as the world seems to get more and more dangerous, I think that having domestic sources of energy are absolutely critical, and we've taken important steps to do that. Second thing is education. My wife and I homeschooled our children, and they've done a very good job of taking that education and using it out in the real world, very proud of their accomplishments. But what we really took away from that is that parents should have a choice. And I think you're going to see school choice, even though you have good schools here. That's not necessarily true around the whole nation. And so for parents to have the ability to find, advocate, and have resources to take their children to the best option for them, I think drives a lot of innovation. I've toured a number of charter schools, both here in the district as well as Success Academy down in New York City, that has had just extraordinarily successful outcomes and results. And so part of my service in this Congress is to advocate for school choice and for better outcomes in education. The last thing I'll focus on is spending. You may have noticed that we are in a dialogue nationally on the debt ceiling. And just last week, I'm very proud that the Republican majority put forth a responsible bill to reduce spending, and that provides for a very good path forward to get this very difficult situation that we're in financially under control. Government spending is probably, I would say, reckless government spending is one of the most important and largest drivers of inflation in our economy. And so the fact that we have passed a resolution to address the debt ceiling and have sent it to the Senate for their consideration is something that I'm very proud of. And I would encourage you to advocate for Senator Schumer and for the White House to start participating in the negotiations so that we don't end up in a crisis. So I think the focus on spending is absolutely critical, particularly so that we don't imperil our children and grandchildren's future, but also that we get inflation under control and back away from the very reckless spending course that we've been on. Just for context, and I think people are amazed by this, you remember the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And you remember the TARP programs and other government programs that infused a lot of stimulus into our economy. That was $2 trillion, approximately, of government deficit spending. In the last 3 years, it's been $10 trillion. $10 trillion that's been added to our national debt that we are now paying interest on, just as interest rates have gone much higher, and that is why we have inflation. And inflation actually helps people that are wealthy and own assets. But if you live paycheck to paycheck, like 63% of Americans, you fall farther and farther behind. In fact, in the last 2 years, working class Americans, have lost 10 years of real wages. They have gone backwards 10 years, and that's not fair. It's not sustainable, and it's not right. And so it really takes some very difficult decisions to step up to these challenges. So before we get into the questions, which we'll start here in just a minute, as I brought up my background, I have a lot of experience in technology, in business, in finance. I have experience in foreign countries. I spent a year at Harvard in Asian studies and Chinese studies. I was in Tiananmen Square in 1989. It's the last time I was in China. Just a few days, I can't remember, before or after Mr. Gorbachev was there, and about 3 weeks before the crackdown. We live in a very, very complex world. We are facing extremely complex financial issues. Technology is changing our lives, changing our lives at a very great pace, including the lives of our children, and it's very complex. And my fundamental belief is that a lot of leadership in this country, whether it's political or economic or other forms of leadership, actually rely on this complexity and to drive things towards their ends and to their benefit, and instead of to the benefit of the people. And one of my motivations, if I go through my experience and motivation, is to bring the expertise and experience that I have, which is unusual. There aren't any other nuclear engineers in Congress. So that we can really take these issues head on, not be afraid of the complexity, and work out real solutions that work for the average American, and not just for big companies, for China, or for other special interests. And I think that's exactly what's needed here in central New York in the Mohawk Valley. To the purpose of this town hall, which is dialogue. And I will tell you, I've done 3 of these now, and I've seen a lot of interesting behavior. And particularly, it comes with people that want to disrupt this dialogue. And they want to disrupt it because they don't believe in our system. Our system requires the dialogue, and disrupting it disrupts that dialogue. And the disruption is always to get control and to censor so that they can get power. And so thank you, that's exactly my point, thank you. So disrupt to get control, to get power. Thank you. And so the best way to do that is to have questions come in. I've not seen them, I don't filter them, and I will try to address them as directly and as completely as we can in the time allowed. So anyway, thank you all for participating. I think you care about this country every bit as much as I do, and I appreciate very much that you're here.
All right, so you ready? A lot of good questions here. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And again, thank you for everybody for being here tonight. The first one I did was a lot of fun. It was a lot of energy and interaction here.
Fun for you.
Fun for me, yes. But there's a lot of good questions here, and I'm going to really try to ask them in no particular order, so hopefully I can get to as many as possible. The first question, I guess, is the most general, is what is your highest priority for the 22nd District, your number 1 priority? And whoever wrote this question stated at the bottom, SOS, save our Social Security. So I'm not sure if that's what they're looking for, but that's what's on the card.
So my number 1 objective is to love and serve the people of New York's 22nd District. It is really the sole purpose. Many of this dialogue is really like a job interview. And every public interaction that I have is a job interview. And you get to pick who represents you and who represents this area. And I tell my staff all the time that there's nobody in Washington, D.C. that can vote for me. They're all here. And so, we're doing, 12 or 13 of these town hall conversations live. There's actually not that many members of Congress that do live town halls. But I'm here to be answerable and to answer questions. So number 1 is really just to serve the 760,000 people that represent NY22. Like I said, I don't have a career in politics. I was not seeking a career in politics. I just believe that we need better leaders. And my function is to stand up and provide that leadership. And I did highlight some of the issues that I focus on: energy, education, and our spending.
And any thoughts on the point that the person had here as far as saving our Social Security?
Yeah, Social Security, there are absolutely no plans whatsoever to cut Social Security or Medicare. There's enormous amount. These are not entitlement programs. These are paid-in benefit systems that people have paid into, and the government has made a commitment to pay that back out. And so there's a lot of advertising that gets spent to provide fear on these kinds of issues that are simply not true. And it's really important, no matter what your political affiliation is, that you spend the time and effort to find out what's really true. And that means looking across different media channels and seeking out other information. But there is absolutely no plans or discussions that I'm a part of that make cuts to Social Security or Medicare, and there's nothing in the bills that we passed, that would do that. So.
That can tie into a little bit of this next question. I know you already made some remarks about the debt ceiling and the debt crisis issue. And so I think one of the attendees wants you to go a little bit further with specifics. And they ask, what specific steps would you like taken so that the United States does not default on its debt? Please be specific, not simply stating something like just spending less.
The United States has the best credit of any country on earth or any other entity on earth, which is why we have the highest credit rating and always have. The debt ceiling discussions are a time where we come together and there is a reason to talk about and make decisions about spending. And guess what? Nothing is more political than spending. Nothing. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, spending is an inherently political process. So what you're seeing in the media, what you're seeing in the statements and postures is literally just negotiations of a political discussion out in the open. And there is so much gamesmanship that goes into it, which I think, frankly, is very dangerous. The House Republicans have passed a bill to address both spending and the debt limit. Basically, it raises the debt limit by $1.5 trillion or 12 months, whichever comes first. And it freezes funding at 2022 levels, which I would point out, 2022 levels was passed by a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president. So I'm not sure why there's opposition to these things. It does, over 10 years, saves $4.3 trillion. You might notice that we're paying a lot in interest, and so trying to lower our spending habits, I think, is a very good idea. But only in Washington, D.C. can you increase the amount of money that you spend, which is exactly what we've proposed, and people cry bloody murder that we're cutting. And we're actually increasing from 2022 levels, 1% per year, each year for 10 years. And so there is a lot of gamesmanship, there's a lot of negotiations, there's a lot of politicizing of all of these issues, but that fundamentally is what the Republican House has passed and sent to the Senate. And you may know, this is a school, so we can talk about civics for just a minute. We pass a bill, it goes to the Senate. Maybe it gets approved, maybe it gets marked up, sent back to the House for reconciliation before going to the President to be signed. And so the House has done its job. And it's now the Senate's turn, and I think we should be watching that very carefully. Did that answer the question?
Are there any specific proposals for cutting anything that have been put out there by the Republicans?
It's all spelled out. I think, clawing back unallocated COVID funds is a big part of it. I think, not permitting the president to unilaterally forgive debts is, there's one of the disruptors is talking about benefits for veterans. I've just signed on to a letter from a number of veterans like myself that are members of Congress to the Secretary of the VA. And the Secretary of the VA put out a press release saying that the Republican proposal and bill cut veteran benefits. It's absolutely not true. It's literally an egregious lie being told to the American people by the Secretary of the VA. In fact, veteran spending is mandatory spending, not discretionary spending. And the only discussions are on the discretionary side. So the fact that he would use his office to make such an egregious misstatement to the American people is absolutely outrageous. There's more veterans serving in Congress today than any time since the 1970s. And I am one of many. The person who is leading this effort, her name is Jen Kiggins. Jen was a Naval Academy graduate. She represents the Norfolk area around Virginia in Congress. She was a helicopter pilot for the Navy, had a good career, and in order to raise her kids, left military service because her husband is, I think, a F-18 pilot. And she went to nursing school, became a nurse practitioner, and had a very successful healthcare career before getting involved in state legislator in politics in Virginia and now serving in Congress. She is the one who has written this letter. It's very sharply worded, and I commend her for her leadership of putting that together. So these are things that we're taking head on. Keep in mind that we have to have a dialogue, but we also need the Secretary of the VA, for example, to actually tell the truth to the American people. It's a tremendous disservice.
Okay, this next question, I know this is an issue that's been in the news recently. I think you had some coverage of a moving van outside your Utica office, and you've spoken to this, so maybe I can ask you to or respond to attendees' question about living in the district, where they ask, have you given any consideration to renting or buying a condo, an apartment, etc. in the district in which you serve? It would be nice to see that you live, eat, and give back to your district. Maybe it would help you get a better understanding of where we live.
It's a popular question. I currently live 1.8 miles outside of the district. Of course, there's no legal requirement to live in the district, but it is something that we've said that we would do. There's a couple reasons that I've not moved into the district. Number one is the state assembly and the state senate are actually considering redistricting congressional lines again. And I think, when I first got into this race, I actually was in the middle of whatever that district was before they redrew them back in May of the last year. And so it'd be awfully foolish of me, don't you think, to sell my farm and then move somewhere and have the lines change yet again. So there's some uncertainty that's hanging out there. The second reason that we've not sold our home is that my mother-in-law, very feeble and moved in with us about 2 years ago. And my wife has been the primary caregiver to her. We built ramps in our home to accommodate her. There's a lot more to that story. And she actually passed away 6 days ago. And tomorrow morning I'll be flying to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for her service to be interred with my father-in-law. And so we've actually faced a very difficult choice of caring for her, of starting this career, of also trying to get settled in this new role. And so we face a lot of issues that tend to put selling our farm in the middle of winter in central New York on the back burner. But we're actually in discussions with 2 different parties that are considering making an offer to acquire our farm. But quite frankly, just on a personal level, we're just at the beginning of really being able to have the mental and physical and emotional bandwidth to take on that issue. It's hopefully you have some understanding that it's not a simple thing simply to sell your home, and it does take time. I've been in office for 100 days, 110 or 15 days. So I think it's a bit of a disingenuous attack. The last thing is, renting a place somewhere else. I'm not sure how many of you could take on the rent and cost of another household. My household cannot. And so these are big blocks and big decisions that we're making, and we're moving in a good faith direction, but we've got, I think, some personal hurdles that we need to get over first. So we've said that we will. We're going to wait to make sure that the lovely assembly is not going to move lines again. The courts will not gerrymander again, and then we'll be ready to take that action. So those are the facts. My goal here is just to answer you directly, and those are the issues at our kitchen table, and hopefully they resonate with you as well.
All right, this is a broad question, but I think it pertains somewhat to what's been going on in the news in the past few weeks concerning some issues going through the federal courts with lawsuits and ultimately at the Supreme Court concerning what is your stand on birth control, and I assume the audience member would also be speaking about abortion medications.
So I am pro-life, and I say that. And I say that in answer to this question every time, because I said the same thing in the primary, I said the same thing in the general, and I'll say the same thing as an elected member of office. It's unfortunate to me that we've politicized this issue into such a divisive way, but it is the world that we live in. I very much believe in the sanctity of life, and I support adoption centers. I support and believe in crisis pregnancy centers, and I think that it's entirely appropriate and moral to support and promote life and to choose life. And so there's a difficult set of issues that we have to deal with, and the first is the Dobbs decision has put this decision in the hands of the states. I do believe in federalism. I do believe that that is how our system works. I talked at length that our system requires dialogue, and here we are having a dialogue. And our system is a federalist system, which means the states have rights, and the courts have clearly pushed this decision to the states. So the consequence of that is that I will not support a federal ban on abortion. And it is simply going to have to get resolved in New York State. We have, in my opinion, a discussion to have in New York, and as New Yorkers, about late-stage abortion and partial birth abortion, and some of the practices that are permitted in our state. And I hope you will think seriously about those. But I'm not going to allow it to become a federal issue again, because I think that the Roe v. Wade decision postponed, I think, 43 years or so, postponed this discussion that we have to have at the state level to really sort out how we feel about this. And so that's where I stand on that issue.
Okay, moving to the border issue. There's a bunch of questions on this, so I'll try to ask a few that kind of combine some of the questions. Is the southern border crisis going to be addressed by Congress sooner rather than later? I assume you could acknowledge whether there is a crisis there or not. And also, what are you going to do to prevent the overrun at the border after Title 42 expires? I believe that's in a few weeks here. And if you could explain what Title 42 is. I'll repeat that at all if you need to.
Yeah, the nuance of Title 42, I'm not going to be able to add a whole lot to the conversation. And, just say that up front. There are millions and millions and millions of desperate people that have come across our southern border. And it's true that they are women and children and, in some cases, families and workers that are seeking a better life. But there are also people from, I don't remember, like 160 different countries. There are people from China. There are people on the terrorist watch list. There are people that are trafficking enormous amounts of fentanyl over this open border. And the United States government is actually using our resources to transport these people all over our nation. You may have noticed that the mayor of New York City yesterday, Eric Adams, started talking like a Republican about the crisis at the border. The city of Chicago, that just elected a very progressive mayor, is talking about a crisis, an immigration crisis in their city that they do not have the resources to have, and yet there are still people who claim that we do not have a border crisis. And that's just patently absurd to make that assertion. If you don't have a border, you're not a nation. We need immigrants in this country. We are a nation of immigrants in this country. We need immigrants in this community. We need more workers in this community. And we need a system, an organized, merit-based system that brings in the workers that we need. And I would welcome them. I have welcomed Iraqi refugees into our home for meals. I have worked with them in our fields. I have visited their homes. So I welcome immigrants, but not an unregulated, unsupervised and open border like we currently have in the South. I mentioned that the Secretary of Veteran Affairs was making blatant lies to the American people about benefits. Secretary Mayorkas has made blatant lies under oath in front of Congress on the crisis at the border. And how can we have a dialogue if what we're being told is just patently untrue? You can go there and see it. Many of my colleagues in Congress have gone there and witnessed hundreds and thousands of people crossing over our border and into our country. This isn't, just something that nobody staged this. This happens every single day. And it's really a tragedy that the United States government, moving these people around our country, has literally become one of the biggest human traffickers in the world. And that is not right. I'll tell you just an anecdote story. During my orientation I was in Washington, D.C., about 3 blocks from the Capitol. I was walking to the Capitol building, and I was walking by a big Greyhound-type bus. And literally as I walked by, outpoured all of these people that were in our country illegally, and it was children holding on to their moms with incredible fear in their face and in their eyes. And they were being poured out into the streets of Washington, D.C. There was a church there that was helping and facilitating them. But what really happens in many of these cases is because they're undocumented and living in the shadow of our society, that they live in fear, of, and it makes them actually very prone to be exploited. And we have unbelievable exploitation of these people in our country, and it's just not right.
Just as a follow-up to that, is the Border Patrol, are they demanding or asking for more resources or more manpower that the administration is not giving them?
That's a good question. Border Patrol really falls under, Department of Homeland Security, I believe, and is addressed in committees that I'm not a part of. So I'm not part of the day-to-day conversation with Border Patrol, and so I'm really, frankly, not that well informed on that any more than you would be if you Googled the question. So that's simply just not an area that I know a whole lot about.
Okay, a couple of questions came in on elections and voting laws. So I'll just read this one here. Would you write or support legislation that would include same-day voting, voter ID, and early voting? Or I can't read this one. Same-day voting, voter ID, and no early voting.
So you probably know that voting laws are state laws. It's part of our Constitution that any power not directly and explicitly claimed by the federal government is left to the states. And for the most part, almost entirely, that's where our voting laws come from. They are state laws. Just to be consistent, because I think that's important, is this is a state rights issue. And before we passed federal legislation to correct or alter or adjust these kinds of voting laws, just remember that just because I might want it one way, the next Congress that could have a very different point of view might want it their way. And so giving this power to control state elections to the federal government, I think, is a bad idea. I think that we have to have election integrity. And there has been so much concern over election integrity. The states really have to do a better job. So I can comment on it, which is not the same thing as legislating on it. One thing we could do here in New York State is just simply clean up our voting rolls, our voter rolls. And that's really the first step. I've attended some education sessions as we prepared, for this election. I actually think that the elections are run pretty well here in New York's 22nd. And I know that because, we had a very close election. We had members on our team that went and, to cure ballots. Democrats were there as well. And so we saw firsthand, and not simply because I won, but I do think that because our team looked very closely at the election results, I think actually we've done a very good job in our little corner of New York. I'm not certain that that's true down in New York City. I not run for any offices down there, but New York State really has a voter roll problem, and I know, people who have gotten multiple ballots to their name on election day, and they were people, no, I actually know them. I think you're opposing that I actually know these people. I'm not sure how you can oppose that, because I actually know these people. And they're people of integrity. They're going to shred one and mail in the other. But we need to clean up our voting rolls, and we need to have secure elections. That should be a bipartisan issue, right? Everybody should agree to that. I like the idea of voter ID laws, but I do not like the idea of the federal government dictating them.
And as you know, in this district, farming and agriculture is an important occupation, lifestyle, especially in New York. It's part of our economy, part of your district. Attendee wants to know, our farmers in rural communities are hurting. What are you doing to help them?
Yeah, so my wife and I moved here to start a small farm, and we really got our playbook from the Cornell Small Farm Program. My wife is a master beekeeper. Through Cornell, we set up what really was an agritourism business and to cultivate specialty products. And we threw ourselves into that while I continue to work in my technology business. So guess what? Farming's hard. And we make farming very hard in this state. Actually, New York State is the 5th largest dairy producing state in our country. We have a lot of dairy production right here in NY 22. And I've toured many of these farms. There are dairy farmers in our extended family on my wife's side. And the people that select to stay in farming it's a very hard life, it's very hard work, and they do it for a lot of reasons because they find satisfaction in it. They enjoy growing things and doing those things. And so I commend them. We just can't make it any harder on the farmers. One of the things that I've seen in Congress is the current administration has tried to redefine navigable waterways. And navigable waterways were a really important and positive thing that were defined by the EPA in, I think it's like 1974, it's pretty close to that, because we had, everybody remembers, the river in Ohio, I think it was, that caught fire and burned, for several days and said, look, we've got to do something. And today, we have cleaner air, we have far more trees, we have cleaner water by far than we had 70 years ago. There's a lot more trees in America today than 70 or 80 years ago. Shocking, but true. So the environmental movement has been a tremendous success, and we should celebrate it. But what I find now, like anytime the government is reaching for power, and again, I really believe that our government is reaching for more power than it should have. They are doing it through these rules, and a lot of times it comes in something that sounds nice, like navigable waterways. And what the EPA wants to do in their ruling and redefinitions of what's called WOTUS, or Waters of the United States, is to define, let's say you have a drainage ditch in front of your house. We live in a relatively rural part of the country, lots of drainage ditches. If it fills up with water after a rainstorm like we've had for the last 24 hours, the EPA, an EPA field agent, can actually unilaterally call that a navigable waterway, which is absurd. And with that, bring in the entire force of law of the Clean Water Act to regulate that piece of property and what happens on that piece of property. And they will say that this is critical to protect the environment, but really what they're doing is they're going to small businesses, they're going to farmers, they're going to homeowners. By the way, this could happen to any of you if you own a home. And they're saying, you're a polluter, you're not a farmer. You're a polluter, you're not a business owner. You're a polluter, you're not a homeowner. You want to add that garage addition on the side of your house? Well, you have navigable waterways out front. And so you're going to have to go through this certification and get this, and get this federal inspection and get this state inspection. And there's no homeowner, none of us could afford to do this. And we can't live in a country where the federal government can step in and basically unlawfully seize your property by defining and restricting its use on these kinds of egregious laws. And what I really am concerned about, has anybody heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn? Right, Gulag Archipelago, Soviet dissident that won the Nobel Prize and wrote many famous books, including the Gulag Archipelago, where he documents his experience in his personal experience, as well as interviewing people that were part of the Soviet punishment system. These are people that almost all entirely were political opponents of Lenin and Stalin and of the government. And what he observes is that when you give ordinary people extraordinary power, cruelty always results. And we really need to be paying attention to this, because by giving these incredibly broad powers that have a lot of discretion, what you end up with, again, from the Soviet Union, and the head of Stalin's secret police famously said, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." And I think we're seeing that increasingly, where the federal government has these broad powers, and they will find someone they want to prosecute, and they will go after him either through environmental rules sometimes it's anti-terrorism, sometimes they're actually looking at all of our data in ways that frankly are illegal in this country. And these are the things that all of us should be concerned about, no matter how you feel on one issue, because giving the government too much power is why our system was formed. The government doesn't give us rights. Do you know that? Right? The government does not give us rights. The way our system works is that God has given us rights. And we give rights to the government. That is, in fact, how our system works. And even you participating here today tells me that you are concerned, again, whether you agree with me or not. The rights that we give the government today under this administration could be used by another administration in ways that maybe you won't like. And I want to protect us all from both of those circumstances. This isn't about right or left. This is about really our system of government and our role as the people.
As we are talking about farming and the environment, and part of the role of government is to ensure that the environment is clean and that our planet is protected to some degree. So a bunch of questions on climate change, whatnot, so we'll dive into that. And I'm going to read this question word for word. This is how they wrote it. Why on earth would you not vote for everything or anything to help us save the planet? Our environment needs as much help as it can get. Nuclear power is too dangerous, and photosynthesis with planting trees definitely isn't the answer, as some of the attendees have said that you've described it for.
I can only answer as an engineer, and I frame it as my understanding of science physics, thermodynamics, and economics. It is clear that the climate is changing. And if you look at carbon dioxide levels before the Industrial Revolution, they were about 150 parts per million. Today, carbon dioxide in our environment, even though it's a very small component of our atmosphere, is actually risen about 50% to approximately 220 parts per million. I'm happy to look up those numbers again. I'm pretty sure the increase is about 50%, and yeah, please Google it. I don't mind being corrected, but really the bottom line is that there's been an increase, significant increase since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the question is, what is it that we should do as a response? And there are some really difficult truths that have to be discussed. If the United States went to a zero carbon economy, which by the way would utterly destroy and impoverish the middle class, but if we went to a zero carbon economy, it wouldn't make any difference in the CO2 levels in our atmosphere. China today is commissioning a coal-fired power plant almost every week. And so you may know that we share an atmosphere, right? There's no, the pollution in China does not stay in China. And this is true, by the way, not just in China, but the rest of the world. And so while we continue to take on these issues that are causing inflation, these policies that are driving up costs for working Americans, we're actually not making a difference in the overall CO2 levels in the world, in our atmosphere. We can do it all the way to zero and still not actually have moved the needle. And so it does come down to, well, what is it that we can do? And I think from an energy perspective, there's really four fundamental things about energy. It should be reliable. It should be resilient. We live in a harsh winter climate here. Do any of you want to go without electricity, for 4 days in the winter? I suspect not. So reliable, resilient, it's affordable, particularly for families that are, again, living each month very close. And by the way, that's the majority. Particularly in this district, it's more than the majority. And it also has to be responsible, right? We've phased out, to a large extent, coal-fired plants. Now it comes back to a question of how do we provide energy? And I'm just going to go through some things. You have to have what's called a base load. And a base load is just, no matter, that we are providing this much power on a day-to-day basis, 24/7. The best sources for that are hydro, which we get from Niagara, nuclear, and natural gas. And that's, we're also getting solar and wind, but solar and wind is not steady. You may have noticed that it gets dark here, even here it gets dark, that the wind doesn't blow all the time. And so because of that, we can't tell everybody, don't go home and turn on your heater or turn on your air conditioner or your television until the wind starts blowing. You understand that that's not possible, okay? And so you get to a class of power that's called dispatchable power, okay? Dispatchable power is what you can turn on and off. And dispatchable power almost exclusively comes from natural gas. And here's why. Natural gas is burned in a jet engine. It's almost identical to a jet engine that are on airplanes. And instead of tied to a big ducted fan, it's actually tied to a generator. And that's where natural gas is used to provide electricity. Now, you may know when you get on an airplane, you're not sitting there for 2.5 days on the tarmac waiting for the pilot to warm up the engine so we can go. You hear them turn them on, they come up to temperature, they check all the pressures, and off you go in about 10 or 15 minutes. You need to be able to bring on electric generation in the winter, particularly here, on a really cold day, or on a really hot day in the summer when everybody comes home from school or from work at 4 p.m. and turns on their air conditioners, which is increasingly common here. And if you don't have that, we're going to have brownouts here. Okay? Let me tell you what happens in brownouts. We have companies that we're hoping to lure here, like Micron, that in part they come here because there is reliable power. And you're not going to invest $100 billion in a chip manufacturing if you think the power is going to go off. No one would invest in that kind of environment and make that here. And so we have to have a mix. We have to have a good base load, and I would advocate for a responsible, an environmentally responsible base load, which include nuclear and natural gas. We can have renewables. I spent the day actually looking at the construction of a transmission line. In New York State, the demand for power is not nearby where it's generated. So we have a lot of wind and solar farms being built up in the North Country, and we have these giant transmission lines that go where? New York City. And they, by the way, they go right through here, but they go right past here. And so, you know, they're using our land up here to provide energy down in New York City. This is a lot of wind and solar. And all of the communities around here, I spent the day talking to a few, and the communities around here would need enormous amounts of investment to, for example, make all the buses electric, right? You don't just make, making the buses electric in this one town would actually double the use of energy that the whole town uses in the hours that they use power charging up these buses. Where is that generation capacity going to come from? And more importantly, they don't have it, but even more importantly, they don't have the transmission and distribution lines to be able to, even if you could generate it, you can't transport it to wherever it is you're charging these buses, for example. Unless you want all of the residents of that town paying 2 or 3 times the amount of money that they're currently paying for power. So when you think about this, remember when I gave my introduction, I told you these are complex issues. They're not political issues. They're issues about physics, science, thermodynamics, and economics. And the decisions that we're making are not being made with those things in mind, and they're not being made with our community in mind. And we really have to take a stand to make sure that we're doing common sense things that work for us. So these are common sense things. Getting back to photosynthesis again, I want to make sure I answer all of the questions. I think we all learned in science class that plants take carbon dioxide out of the air through the process of photosynthesis, and they actually store it in the ground. There's a lot of science being done around this. Since we can't control how much other countries produce of CO2, actually one of the things that we can do is have a program to grow more trees, to grow more cover crops in the winter, green cover crops that continue to participate in photosynthesis, to stop soil erosion so that we are not losing the tillable land, or even just the land that will support, trees and plants, to stop desertification or the growing. You might have seen the tremendous droughts until recently out in the West and in California. The deserts are encroaching, and where there are deserts, by definition, there is very little vegetation growth. And so these, by the way, are right out of the environmental playbook of the last 70 years. And these are things that we should be doing. We should be saving the Amazon rainforest and promoting, these huge swaths of green and photosynthesis that are threatened in South America. There's an area on the southern part of the Sahara Desert called the Sahel, and I've actually been there in areas of Mali near Timbuktu. I was there with World Vision, and there were communities that were involved in trying to do exactly these things, not to save the planet, but just to save their communities from being overrun by the Sahara Desert. And there's enormous greenbelt projects happening in the Sahel region of Africa that we should be supporting. And this idea that we can all buy electric vehicles and feel good about ourselves is actually not going to solve the problem. And I say that as an engineer. So these may sound like political issues, and I can't tell you how frustrated I get that I hear simple jargon that pretend to address these critical issues, and the decisions we're making are hurting people here in Central New York. And we can't allow that, and that's part of why I'm here.
Now to dramatically switch gears here, we're going to go to a question: what can be done to prevent boys competing against girls in Title IX sports?
Yeah. When I served on submarines, it was men only. And I'm trying to think of the year, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it was maybe 2010 or 11. They started introducing women onto the crews of nuclear submarines. And sometime in the next 2 or 3 years, I believe, we will actually have the first woman commanding a nuclear submarine in our fleet. And within too long, we'll actually have a woman commanding officer and executive officer, and they are performing extraordinarily well in those roles. And something that we all as a nation, quite honestly, should be very proud of. The physical differences between men and women don't come into play on a nuclear submarine. It is a tremendously powerful weapon, a tremendously complex machine. And should there come a conflict with China, that will be the front line. And it's very likely that these women will be some of the most important soldiers and defenders of our nation. If you look at the women candidates, there's actually documented, if you look at their background, for all of these tremendous and tremendously successful pioneers, almost every single one of them was a college athlete, or at least a high school athlete. And the things that they learned in college sports, teamwork, competitiveness, excellence, grit, endurance, all of the fortitude is part of the makeup of their success. And to tilt that scale by taking a biological male and putting them in direct competition with these young women at this formative age in their life is simply not right and cannot be allowed. I would point out that this is one of these issues that the progressive left is using to disrupt our dialogue, to get control, to get power. And the reason I say that is the only other Democrat to stand to announce a run for president, Robert Kennedy, actually has come out and said exactly the same thing that I just said. And so I think we have to think about what is it that the progressive left is really driving at, and what is that purpose? Because for a long time, and I think very admirably, it was about equality for women. And here we are on the cusp of tremendous equality and opportunity and responsibility in our military. And we've already seen that in aviation and in other combat roles. And I'm not really sure that this is being driven as a Democrat priority. It's really being driven as a progressive priority. And I think we have to make that stop.
Is there anything at the federal level that could be done to prevent biological men from competing against women as well?
Well, we just passed a bill that actually would prohibit that. So it's been done. Now it's got to go through the Senate.
All right, now turning to gun violence and gun control, do you support an assault weapon ban? If not, why not? Do you think 18-year-olds should be able to purchase weapons of war without training?
So, the issue of gun violence, we see really at these shocking events where some very evil people are killing some very innocent people. And it's very heartbreaking and it's very tragic. I would point out that New York State has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, including an effective ban on virtually every conceivable assault rifle, as they're called. And we still have gun violence in our cities and in our communities. So I would say that, boy, if that was the solution, we would have solved that problem right here in New York State, but of course that's not true. And the fact is that if you take away or ban weapons from law-abiding citizens, the only people that end up with weapons are criminals. Constitution, in defense of our Constitution. It was clearly spelled out and has been validated. But in New York State, we have a crime problem more than we have a gun problem. And cashless bail and putting these criminals back on the street over and over again is one of the things that's harming our society. I sat down with all of the sheriff's offices of the 3 counties, and in Onondaga County, Sheriff Shelley told me that just a few years ago, their officers were processing 2,000 warrants a year. And a warrant is a good metric to see how many people they're interacting with and the amount of paperwork that's required to process someone that's suspected of a crime. Last year, they did 7,500, almost 4 times the number. And because of cashless bail and putting repeat criminals back out on the street, it has this very interesting and tragic and unexpected consequence that those police officers that we really count on to be out patrolling our streets engaging with citizens, engaging in schools, educating our children about the dangers of drugs, all of these kinds of things, the police officers have less and less time for because they're processing the paperwork for the repeat offenders. And when you go from 2,000 to 7,500, there are countless hours, man hours, women hours of these officers' time that's being taken, not keeping us safe on the streets, but that is one of these unexpected consequences of cashless bail. And again, these are complex issues, and we really need to think through these. I think the question was, I will not support a national ban on assault rifles. That would have no effect here in New York State. I grew up around guns. I was qualified as an expert marksman in the Navy and pistol, and have hunted my whole life and have been a gun owner really my whole life. So I strongly support our Second Amendment.
Very quick follow-up, because I know we only have a few minutes left on that. Is there support, what's the view in Congress among your colleagues for allowing 18-year-olds to purchase these powerful weapons?
Yeah, I actually have no idea. It's not come up for a vote, and to my knowledge, it's not on the docket to be reviewed or to come up for a vote or to get on the House floor. So I'll be honest, I just haven't had a single discussion about it, and not aware of any plans. That's not to say there aren't plans. You probably know that there's red states, different from our community, but I'm not aware of any of those plans, and I'm not part of any of those discussions. So that's a simple fact. So.
And I know this was a question that was brought up last time as well. If you want to answer this quickly, do you see, when there's a lot of talk about socialism in the media now as a threat to our country, do you believe socialism is a threat to our country, and if so, in what way?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that socialism is a threat to our country. I think if you look at the teaching of Marx and Hegel and the Frankfurt School, and if you look at what did Marx originally say was going to happen? He said that there was going to be this economic divide between the proletariats and the bourgeois, and the proletariats were going to rise up and take power, except that didn't actually happen. And so what they've done is they've taken the ideology of Marxism, which is really known as dialectic materialism. It really calls for tearing down of the establishment to build up something new. And it really gets back to my opening statement. The very purpose of socialist ideology is to disrupt, to take control, to get power. And when you look at what's being done in our society, we're impoverishing the middle class, but we're arguing about these cultural Marxist ideology issues over here. Why? Because that disrupts the conversation. They use censorship. They encourage self-censorship, also known as wokeness, to perform this. And these really are the things that these are really the things that have driven this division. And it's a disruption to get control, to get power. And it's been going on for a long time. And we really need to stand up to it. America has a unique place in history. Socialism has failed everywhere. And we're still... And it's actually shocking to me. We had a vote in Congress to condemn socialism, and there were actually almost right at 100 Democrats who voted, and these are the progressives, who voted to not condemn socialism, even for all the harm that it's done. Because here's the reality about America. America occupies a unique place in the world. Even in our imperfection, people look to us to be a beacon of freedom, of common sense, of economic growth and development. And that has really been tarnished in the last few years. If America falls, if we continue going on the path that we're on, and America falls, there's no one in the world to save us. There's no one with our values. There's no one with our history. We saved Europe twice in the last century. And there is no one capable of coming to save us. And so we have to get it right in this country, and the entire world depends on that.
So we got through almost all of them, so thank you.
I would
We did
just
get
say
through
as-
almost all of them.
I would just say as a closing comment that you've been very civil and very engaged, and you showed up because you care. I register your red cards and your green cards. I couldn't possibly have said, well, there are politicians who will try to get everybody in the room to agree with them. And I think you can probably sense that that's not gotten us in a very good place. So it is a privilege to represent the people of New York, and it is we have to stand together, even if we disagree. We have to stand together against the people that are trying to disrupt, to get control, and to take power. That's what this dialogue's about. So thank you for coming.